For us, consciousness is associated with enlightenment and illumination and daytime and sunrise and the bright noon sky, and the unconscious is associated with the nighttime. And the reason for that partly too is that your unconscious is actually a lot more active at night. First of all, that's when you dream. And it's also the time when, if you're frightened of something or if you're depressed and ruminative, the frightening thoughts and the depressing and ruminative thoughts are going to come up. So many people have the experience of waking up in a kind of quasi-cold sweat at 3 in the morning and having, nothing but a continual stream of worries run through their head. And there's pretty good evidence that a lot of what you're doing at night when you sleep, when you're dreaming and when you're not dreaming, is actually processing threat. But most of the time you're asleep for that. Sometimes you wake up during it and it's like, it's not something you really want to be conscious about, It's hard on you, and it's very common among people who are depressed, So if you want to diagnose someone for depression, one of the things you ask them is, well, is your sleep chopped up? Do you wake up multiple times at night? And when you wake up, what happens? And if they say, well, I have worries running through my head and I can't stop them, that's rumination, because it's an automatic process, it's an unconscious process. Then you know that the balance between positive and negative emotion has shifted too far for that person. There's so much chaos and pain in their life, or their emotional systems have become dysregulated, that it's starting to pop up into consciousness and dominate it. So, now, the yin-yang symbol is interesting for a variety of other reasons too, because the Taoists believe that symbol represents being. Now, being is not the same thing as objective reality. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. That's being. And for the Taoists, being is made up of these two elements: order and chaos. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. The reason for that is wherever you go, and whenever you live, and whoever you are, each environment that you're in is composed of things you understand, and things that work the way you expect them to, and things you do not understand, and that can pull the rug out from you at any moment. And so you can say in some sense that these symbolic representations are representations of the most unchanging elements of being. So the most real things, because, a typical modern person will look at this and think, well, those aren't real. It's like, they are real. In fact, they're hyper-real. Because one of the things that defines real is that it's permanent. And it is permanent. No matter where you go, there are things you know and things you don't know. And it doesn't matter who you are. It's permanent. So it's part of the existential landscape of human being. Now, the other thing there's two other things that are quite cool about the yin-yang symbol, and one is that each of the black paisley has a little white dot in it, and the white paisley has a little black dot in it. And the reason for that is the Taoists also recognize quite well that chaos could turn to order at any moment. So a new order can arise out of a chaotic structure. That's a revolution in some sense. But by the same token, if you're in a place that's orderly and predictable, something can happen that casts you into a chaotic situation right away. So there's a dynamic. Even though these two things oppose each other in some sense, there's a continual dynamic interplay between them. And then the final thing that's quite interesting about this symbol, this is a mind-bogglingly brilliant idea, is that, because the Tao also means the way, and the way is the line between the two. And so what that indicates is, this is a brilliant idea, is that the optimal position for a human being isn't in chaos or in order, because if it's too much order, then it's totalitarian, and if it's too much chaos, then it's disgust and fear and emotional pain and depression. So where's the proper place? And the Taoist answer is right on the line, where you have one foot in order so that you're fairly stable, and you have another foot in chaos so that new and interesting and compelling and transforming things are happening to you. And one of the things that you might note is that your nervous system basically tells you when you're there, and the way it tells you is by making you interested in whatever it is that you're engaged in. Because the fact that the thing that you're engaged in grips you, which is really an unconscious process, you can't really control that, it's something that happens to you, is because your nervous system, which is actually adapted to the environment of chaos and order, is telling you that if you're engaged and interested, you are in the place where the balance between chaos and order is perfect. Now you think about that. It's no use reading a paper that you cannot understand at all, even though hypothetically that would be a tremendously informative paper, right? But you can't understand it because it's all chaos to you. And then there's absolutely no reason reading a paper the 10th time if you've already extracted the information out of it. It's going to be boring. Okay, so what do you want? Well, you want a paper that you can almost understand. So there's, the frameworks, the cognitive frameworks that you have at hand are sufficient for you to take the next step into the unknown, and the paper will inform you of that. And so those are the sorts of things. Books do that, movies do that, conversations do that, even lines of thought do that. If they're exactly at the right level of complexity for you, they're going to engage you. And people know this, man. They know it. So here's an example. Let's say you're trying to, we could say you're trying to teach your child to talk, which of course you don't do. What you do to a child is talk to it. But it's very interesting because there have been studies of how parents talk to children. And what they do is always use language that's slightly more complex than the child can understand. And they do it automatically. It's part of our, in some sense, our innate knowledge structure about language. So you don't only use words that the child understands. Use words that they understand plus a few words and phrases and sentence constructions that they don't. And so that's sort of pulling them along. And a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky called that the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is that place, because it's a place in the environment where information flow into the psyche is maximized. And that has to be, so it has to be quasi-comprehensible. It's something I try to do in my lectures. I try to tell you things that you know and associate them with things that you don't know so that you're not swamped, hopefully, by an excess of incomprehensible information, but you don't think, oh God, he's saying that again, I already know that, etc., etc. And anything that's dramatic in structure is doing that for you. It's keeping you on the edge of attention. And that place is where your adaptation is maximized, because not only are you firming up the structure that's underneath your feet, you're relying on it, and it's part of the platform on which you stand, but you're absorbing information at a rate that allows you to increase the solidity and area of that solid ground without undermining you so much that it falls apart beneath you. So it's lovely, it's such a good idea, because think about what it would mean if it was true. It would mean that if you pay attention to what captures your interest and you follow that, that means you're going to always be interested in what you're doing. But even better than that, it's going to mean that you're going to maximize your adaptive capacity as much as possible at exactly the same time. Man, that'd be a great deal if it actually happened to be true. Now, it's a bit complicated because what culture wants from you and what is intrinsically interesting to you, there's going to be a conflict there, right? Because culture wants you to do what a good cultural entity should do, which is to do what you're told to do. But you're not, you're not a robot. And so part of the existential problem that you have in life is trying to figure out some compromise between what you find personally engaging and that develops and supports you, and what the culture will provide resources to you for pursuing. And it's hard. There's no simple answer to it. But I would say that if you sacrifice your capacity to engage in meaningful activity to the security of a given position in a dominance hierarchy, then you turn into something that's like a soulless slave. And that's a really bad idea, because there's no way you can do that for any length of time without getting bored and resentful. And once you're bored and resentful, the move from that to dangerous is a very, very small step. So it's hard, and it isn't even necessarily the case that you're going to make the balance. You're going to be able to manage it. But if you don't, you're going to pay a massive price for it. So I would say, don't let people mess around with what you find compelling any more than is absolutely necessary. So, because it's very dangerous to do that. It's very dangerous to do that. Just like it's dangerous not to find a position in a dominance hierarchy at all, because then you end up in a chaotic place. And my experience has been, you might wonder about this, it's like, what's the probability that someone can live a healthy life, healthy, productive, and stable life outside a dominance hierarchy, so without external structure? And the answer to that is, there might be one person in this class that could do that. It's really hard, because what happens to most people is that if they don't have a substantial amount of external structure and routine, they just fall apart. They don't sleep properly, they don't eat properly, they're depressed. it's tremendously effortful to continually reinvent yourself day after day. And so there's some real utility in routine and social identity. You know, and Jung would say the part of you that has adapted to routine and social identity is the persona, and sort of the mask you wear in public. It might even be who you think you are. And he thought that people who were only persona were dangerous because they were only thoughtless advocates of the system for which they stood. But he also believed that people who had no persona were in an equally terrible situation because they're psychologically chaotic and they don't have a social structure around them to hem them in and continually remind them how to be sane and productive. So it's a matter of balance, you know. There's horrors on both sides and there's advantages on both sides, and the trick is to place yourself in a location where you're deriving maximal advantage from both. And you'll be able to tell if you do that, because if you are doing that, you're going to find your life engaging and meaningful enough so the fact that it's also tragic and potentially composed at least partially of slavery is going to be acceptable. And that's the goal in some sense. It's hard to do that, but you know, it's hard not to do it too. So you're screwed either way. So you might as well pick the path that's going to be of maximal utility to you. You know, so, and hopefully to everyone else. Okay, so this is the individual instead. So we have explored territory and unexplored territory, or the known and the unknown, or order and chaos, and then we have the thing that mediates between them, and that's the individual. And this is an old medieval representation which I really love. You know, there's the dome of the sky there. It's a very archaic idea that the earth is a dome, because it kind of looks like that if you go out in a flat field, you know, if you're out in the ocean, the world looks like a dome on a disc. And so that's sort of the representation here. It's a very ancient idea. And this guy at the bottom left of the picture is poking his head through the comprehensible world and looking at the chaos beyond. And so he's a heroic figure. So the knower is the individual, is always the hero of a story, right? The protagonist of a story. Now it can be an anti-hero too, because just like the known has a negative element and a positive element, and the unknown has a negative element and a positive element, the individual has a negative element and a positive element.